Okay, folks, I have just a couple more people that I need to let in from the waiting room, and then we'll get started. Again, if you could mute yourself if you haven't already done so, I would appreciate it. Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Sisser, and I'm the Executive Director of the Hancock Historical Museum in Findlay, Ohio. And I am also a member of the Board of Directors of Friends of Ohio Barns, or FOB as we like to call it. And that's the role that I'm serving tonight. And it's my pleasure to be able to facilitate our virtual lecture series for Friends of Ohio Barns. Our mission is really to raise awareness about the wonderful historic barns that we have in our state, and hopefully get the message across that we need to steward these barns, preserve these barns. And the way that we do that is really primarily through education. And so we educate the public in a number of ways. We have an annual conference that's well attended, where we move to a different county in Ohio each year. We have timber framing workshops that we've conducted. We have a newsletter, and we're active on social media and on our website. And finally, during COVID, we, out of necessity, began this virtual lecture series as another way to reach our membership and people throughout the state of Ohio and really all over the country. And tonight I'm learning even internationally, because I heard we have somebody joining us from England to learn more about what an English barn is. So this is a great way for us to be able to raise awareness. So thank you for joining us tonight. If you are not otherwise familiar with Friends of Ohio Barns, I would certainly encourage you to visit our website at friendsofohiobarns.org, and you can learn a little bit more about what it is that we do throughout the state. And you can also learn about some additional programming that we have coming up. So this is our final virtual lecture in our series this year. And if you're interested in learning more about some Friends of Ohio Barns events, we have our annual conference coming up in April, and registration is actually open. Early bird registration is open for that right now. So you can do that via our website, and you can join us then in Morrow County this year at the end of April, and we'd love to have you. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started tonight. I want to remind you all to please stay muted throughout Jack's lecture. There are certainly a lot of us joining this evening, and of course we want to keep things quiet so that we can hear what he has to tell us. And also, if you have any questions that come up through tonight's lecture. Oh, I'm seeing another chat that we have somebody from Canada joining us tonight as well. So we have definitely an international crew. If you have any questions that come up as Jack is speaking, feel free to put them in the chat function, just as you're thinking of them. And then certainly when Jack is done speaking, put your questions in there, and I will then facilitate the question and answer period. I can ask Jack those questions from the chat. So that'll help to keep things kind of organized for us as well. We are going to try to get everything wrapped up tonight by 8:15 because we want to be respectful of Jack's time, but also because I have to go pick up my daughter from dance class. So that'll be the point at which we have to end. So without further ado, I want to be able to get started and hand things over to Jack, because he has a lot of great information to share with us tonight. Jack Sobon is an architect and builder specializing in timber framed buildings. Since 1976, he has devoted his life to understanding the craft of timber framing. Using only traditional hand tools, he has framed and erected over 50 structures. As architect, he consults on historic structures and designs new timber framed structures. He was a founding director of the Timber Framers Guild and a founder of the Traditional Timber Frame Research and Advisory Group, an offshoot of the Guild. He has 4 books to his credit and has taught over 80 all-hand tool workshops. Jack, take it away.
Thank you, Sarah. So, good evening, everyone. Tonight I'm going to talk to you about the English barn. And this is a barn type that, of course, was brought here from England. Let me see, I need to get this show started here. I got something in the way. Oh, here we go. There we go. Yeah, it's a barn type that was brought here from England by the first settlers, and was predominant throughout the Northeast. I'm sure there's examples in Ohio. It was sort of the standard barn type. And here in New England, it's pretty much all the early barns were this particular style. So here's an illustration of what an early example might have looked like. This is actually a barn that's along the eastern side of Massachusetts. And it's an early building. It has a steep roof and it has a purlin roof, which a common purlin roof. So there's these small little purlins running across, sort of harken back to the thatched roof days, as does the pitch of the roof. Anyway, it's a simple form, a simple gabled building, and it has 3 bays and a doorway in the middle of the long sides, and smaller animal doors off to either end. And it's a standard. So you're going to find this throughout New England. They've been modified, of course, over the years, and other later barns have been changed to a different function and style completely. But let's just talk about the English barn. So the plan is virtually universal. It's almost as though the people got off the boats in Plymouth and Boston and were handed a little handbill that says, here's the barn you want to build, because they're identical throughout the area, which is amazing to me. I can almost describe someone's barn over the phone. If I think they have an English barn, I can tell them where the animals were in the barn and which way it faced. So here's a typical floor plan. And I said it was 3 bays. Let me see if I can get my tools here. There we go. Oh, go back. So 3 bays to the right, usually to the east in the barn, were the cows, and they accessed it through a small door on the longitudinal side. And there were stanchions that faced the threshing floor. And that bay is usually pretty small, 9-10 feet or so, just wide enough for the animals. And the animals usually stood on the dirt. Later, they would add floors into these, or if the barn was on a hillside, a sloping site, they might have had a wooden frame floor. But typically, the animals were standing on the ground, and the manure was left there, and straw was added to it, and it was composted right in the floor of the bay, and then broken out in the spring or summer to be spread. And then above the cows was a loft where their hay was stored. So next we have the threshing floor, which is the middle bay. And it's usually 10, 12, 11, 12 feet wide. And that's, as it sounds, that was where the crops were dried on a scaffold up above, and then brought down and threshed on that threshing floor with by hand. And there's usually a large door, at least at one end, large wagon doors, sometimes at both ends, but there's at least a smaller door at the opposite end so that you could open the doors and get a breeze to your winnowing of your grain. And notice, by the way, this barn is not symmetric. The bay on the left here is far wider. Sometimes it's 20 feet or even more, depending on the length of the barn. So this bay has 2 functions. One is there's a mow that goes from the ground up to the roof to be stacked with hay. And it's separated from the threshing floor by a mow rail or a waste board. I mean, there's a lot of different names for this, but it's basically to keep the hay off the threshing floor and keep the threshing floor grain on the threshing floor. And usually at the south end, or the sunnier end of that bay, there were the draft animals. I show horses here, but in the hill towns where I live in western Massachusetts, they're more likely to be oxen. And you can tell whether your barn had oxen or horses by the height of the loft above the horses here. So if it was oxen, it would be the same height as the loft over the cows. If it's horses, it's usually 6 inches to a foot taller. Because, of course, horses are taller. And then above the horses was also a hay mow as well. And they entered through a door at the opposite end of the barn, like here. And that's usually a 10-foot wide bay. This one shows 4 horses, which is pretty typical. So it's a 10-foot wide structure here. So that's the English barn. And take note of this, the beef roll above. This is where the beef roll is located, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. So where did this form come from? If it's so universal, where did it come from? And I've talked with people in England and looked around, and in southern England, there's nothing that works like this. The climate is much more mild. For instance, England has a temperature range of about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, whereas where I live here, it's about 110 degrees from hottest to coldest during the year. So animals need to be kept in through the winter, whereas they don't in southern England, and they can always have a run-in shed of some sort. So it turns out that the closest thing is in Yorkshire, which is in the north of England. And these are masonry buildings here being shown, but it's the same concept. You have the doorway right through the barns, to do threshing. It wouldn't be a wooden threshing floor, it'd be a stone threshing floor. And there's the loft above the cows. So I believe, everybody sort of was familiar with a northern barn that had animals through the winter, and that's the prototype. Here's surviving stanchions in that cow bay. This is really rare. This is an original set of stanchions. The parts are all hewn and they're pegged together. And the barn has since been burned by the local fire department, but I did manage to measure it up and photograph it pretty well before that happened. There was evidence of 12 animals in here, and I think 2 of the stanchions were pretty small, so probably for calves. And the animal would put its head in there, and then you'd slide this piece over and put a pin in to lock it in position. Now on the threshing floor, well, first of all, the threshing floor is critical to the life of the farm. These were family farms. They were just self-sufficient farms. They did a little bit of everything, and grain was certainly a part of that. So it wasn't like the barns of New York State, the Dutch barns, where they were primarily raising wheat. These barns would have some cows, some draft animals, probably some pigs. They would do butchering, and they do grain as well, wheat and rye, oats. So the threshing floor was critical, and the only time that was used was when they would park a wagon on there, or animals would be hauling the wagon in and out. It wasn't a general place for animals to hang out because it needed to be kept pretty clean. And the floor was done very tightly so that the grain wouldn't fall through the cracks between the boards. So it's either double boarded, where they have a 2-inch plank with little 1/2-inch strips underneath all the joints, or they would actually tongue and groove the boards, which is a little better situation. And it would be seasoned material, and the floor would be framed like a raft, so that it heaving from the frost and settling would not open up joints in the floor. And it was secured with wooden pins. I don't think I've ever seen nails in these floors. They're almost always rectangular wooden pins. And this is a hand flail. This flailing was done by hand. Again, in New York State with these Dutch barns, you'll find animal-powered threshing devices and much bigger threshing floors, 20, 30-foot wide floors. So this was sort of a family operation, and they would have these 2-piece hand flails with a swivel end on them for doing the crop. And it would be brought down onto the threshing floor and worked, and then the straw would be picking up and shooken to get the grain out of it and set aside for bedding. And then you would scoop up the grain in winnowing trays, wooden trays, look like dust trays, and then flip it in the tray, and the wind blowing through the barn would blow the chaff out. And then you put the grain into sacks. Oh, there's a close-up of the flail. These are wooden pins that would hold the floor down. This is my own barn. I built a replica of an English barn. And I use ash pins. So you bore a round hole and drive a square pin in there, and that seems to work like a lag. It actually sucks the board down tight and holds it there. I did this on my own floor, and it hasn't budged. And you can see there's a little bit of a head on top of these pins that grabs into the wood. And I said the floors are built like a raft. Here's the center bay of an English barn, and the joists ran the full width of the barn. They were 30 footers, and I've seen them as big as 40 foot, basically logs that are hewn on the top side. And that's again so that heaving and movement of the building wouldn't separate the joints between the planks and allow the grain to percolate out. Here you can see all the wooden pegs lining up in here to secure those. Now, above the threshing floor, usually at the end with the biggest doors, the sunny end, was what I mentioned before, the beef roll or a butcher's windlass. And again, these people were butchering their own animals for meat. And this would be 3 or 4 feet inside those doors on the main tie beams up above, sometimes on supports going across the braces, so it's a little bit lower. But anyway, the device would sit in there, and they'd round out the ends of the pockets here, as you can see. And this end just has a bored hole, so they would pop it in that hole and then drop it into the slot at the other end. I think I got a picture coming up. Yeah, here's one, not in mortises on the tie beam, but on blocks above. But it's a windlass, so it's a log that's shaped at the ends to about 3 inches in diameter, sometimes 4 inches in diameter, and that sits in those bearing pockets. And then there's holes bored through perpendicular to each other. You can't see it here; you can only see the one, but there's another one perpendicular, 90 degrees to that, separated from a little bit. And farther out, they would have a couple of pegs in there where they would attach chains or ropes to go to the animal's hind legs. And then putting a pole through that hole, standing on the ground floor, 2 people could alternately put a rod in there, rotate it, 30, 50 degrees. And then one person holds it, the next one puts it in the next hole and takes up the slack and then rotates that. So it's like the capstan of a ship. And it gives you a great mechanical advantage, probably a 15-to-1 advantage to haul up these animals. Here's an English barn that has somebody spiked on some big wrought nails, but there's where it sat right there. So a few of these survive, but the evidence is typically in these barns for these. This is a later barn, not an English barn, but it's you can see they sort of set up something here with a slot, a couple of pins to hold it there. Here's a fancier version that has actually a big wheel on it, mounted on it, and a rope would go around the perimeter of that wheel, and you work it like a chain fall. So you just stand on the floor and rotate that thing. The rope would go around the wheel a couple of times and then have a long loop hanging down. So it's a continuous run of rope. And sometimes that actually went to a hand crank device mounted on the posts, which would increase the leverage on the rope if necessary. In fact, you can see a chain hanging from this one with a spreader bar on it where the animal would be attached. Another feature that I've recognized in these barns is the evidence of dovecotes. Now, if you go to England, a lot of the barns over there have a dovecote, usually above the doorway when you're entering the barn. And they call them doves over there. We call them pigeons, but it's pretty much the same sort of bird. And it was basically free food on the farm. The pigeons would glean things from the fields and from the forest and everything, and then the eggs and the birds themselves could be used for food by the farmers. So these are typically up in the gables, usually over the cow bay, which would be the east end. And there'd be these here, the triangular, but they could be rectangular, round, whatever. And there'd be some sort of a platform up there. I've never found a surviving platform, but I've seen mortises where something was sitting up there. So again, it was probably from the very first build, they were incorporating these dovecotes into the barns. And here's another one up here, up in the very peak of the gable. The farmer probably sent his youngest kids up there to scramble up there to get those eggs. Another feature of these barns were eave troughs. Now, not every barn had these, but water was a necessity on the farm. And if you had a stream or a pond nearby, you would need these eave troughs. But if not, if it was a bit of a walk, no farmer was going to go to his well and drop a bucket down 40 times every day to fill up the animal's trough. So here's something that catches the rainwater, and there'd be a big cistern, wooden vat or something it's usually at the cow door end of the building, because if you look at the way these bracket supports pitch, they always go towards the cow end. And I've only found a couple of surviving trough pieces in barns. Some of them are reused as floor joists or something. This is on my own barn, by the way. So sometimes it's a V-shaped slot in there, and then sometimes it's hollowed out with a gutter adds, which I'm going to show you in a minute. But these brackets, they bored a 2-inch hole through each of the 4 posts. And as I said, it pitches down towards one end and drove this, it's usually like a 2-inch by 4-inch head on it, drove that into the post, and that holds up the gutter. Here, when I did my barn reconstruction, I hewed out a gutter from pine, all heartwood, eastern white pine, which is very stable and mildly rot resistant. And this is the gutter adds you're looking at with a curved cutting edge on it. And it took a few hours to make this. It's out of a 4x6 piece of timber, the full length of the building. Oh, here's a surviving one I found in the barn. And actually, this is the beginning of it. So at one end, there's no trough at all. And you see the trough is just starting here and becoming a full V-shaped trough. It goes down. This one, I think, was a 3x5. And it wasn't just the English. The Dutch used these troughs as well, and probably the Germans. Just it's collecting rainwater for the animals. This was a rare find. It's the only one I've ever seen in my lifetime. This was a barn in Savoy, Massachusetts, that had 4 of these still intact. They had the 2-inch diameter part that went into the post still intact. And I was surveying the barn, and I popped a couple of these out. I was going to take them home, and I wanted to dupe him for my barn, and I was going to bring them back. But this is that same barn that the fire department burned a couple of weeks after I pulled this out of there. So I'm so glad I took them home and kept the evidence, I guess. Well, here they are. And these are made out of yellow birch, which is not a particularly rot-resistant species, but it is hard and strong and very common in the area I live in. You often find forged ones as well. You can see that square trough that fit right in here on the part projecting out of the building, and this was driven into a post here. This barn, I'm not sure if these are original, but that's the original siding. And someone nailed a board onto the side of the post that went out through that slot in the siding, and would have a notch cut in it for the gutter to fit into. So I don't know if that's an original detail or just an early one. I believe these were cut nails in here. This is about a 1790s barn. Let's talk a little bit about the size of the barn. They're typically 30 feet by 40 feet. And this is a chart showing barn sizes for the town of Coleraine, I believe it is. I can't see because this darn thing is in the way here. Coleraine, Massachusetts, 1798 direct tax census. So back then they recorded every single building in the Commonwealth, and some of these censuses survive for different towns. So in this town of Coleraine in 1798, just look at all the barn sizes there. There's one 18 by 20, one 20 by 30, but look how many 30 by 40 barns there are. It's 40 of them practically. So, and even these 30 by 50s, they're probably a 40-foot barn with a 10-foot addition on them, and the same with this 30 by 65. So why was the 30 by 40 so popular? Well, it goes back to Pythagoras. Many of you may remember from, with me, it was probably the 7th or 8th grade, but we studied the Pythagorean theorem, which is the sum of the squares of the legs of a right triangle is equal to the square of the hypotenuse. So 3, 4, 5 is one of those perfect triangles. 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16, 9 plus 16 equals 25, and the square root of that is 5. So it's a curiosity today, but in its heyday, it was secretive and it was all powerful. You could not be a builder if you did not know this 3, 4, 5. It was that important. And I found that in carpentry, the builders would sometimes sort of brag about that to themselves and their other builders in the forms of the buildings. So I'm pretty sure that's where the 30 by 40 barn size comes from. And it happens to work nicely for animals as well. More on this. Anyway. Okay. Oh, my computer froze on me here. There we go. So here's a cross section and longitudinal section of a barn in the town that I grew up in, Adams. And it's probably between 1760 and 1790 or so. And it's a 30 by 40 barn. And a very curious thing in this building was that the rafters in one bay are 3 feet on center. And then in the middle bay, they're 4 feet on center. And the last bay, they're 5 feet on center. And this is somewhat approximate because it doesn't add up to 40 feet. I think it adds up to 39 or 41 or something. Anyway, I was measuring the building and I measured all the rafters out, and I got home and I was drawing it up. And I said, I must have messed up. That can't be true. So I had to go back there and verify it. But that's what it was. I've never seen another barn since like that. But I have seen barns where the nailers in the wall, there's like a low waist high gird here at 3 feet. And then this one is at 4 feet. And then the plates at 12 feet to the top. So it's 5 foot. So it's a 3, 4, 5 stepping out of those nailers in the wall. Also what I've discovered, I went to school for architecture, and I know there's always underlying geometry in like Gothic cathedrals and pyramids and Greek temples and all that sort of thing. So I just wondered if that was in barns. So it turns out that yes, I'd say fully 90 to 95% of the English barns I've measured and drew up, I can inscribe an equilateral triangle just like this in the cross section. So the footprint is the 3, 4, 5. The cross section is the equilateral triangle. And if you follow these proportions, no matter how big your barn is, it's going to look identical to every other one. And by the way, the roof pitch on this is a 9 and 12. So 9 inches, 9 inches and 12 inches of run is also a 3, 4, 5. 9, 12, 15 is a multiple of 3, 4, 5. So some math going on here in these old buildings. So now I want to talk a little bit about the carpentry and how it's actually executed. And these earlier barns were built by the scribe rule, which in this area is generally before 1820. The oldest square rule, which is what replaced the scribe rule that I found, is 1801. And it's in Hillsdale, New York, just over the border from me. And so far, I haven't found anything earlier, and everything else seems, as you get away from that, seems to be later. So it seems to be somewhere near roughly Albany, New York, let's say, is the epicenter of the new square rule, which we're going to get to shortly here. But anyway, the scribe rule is what was brought here from Europe. They didn't call it the scribe rule until after the square rule came out. It was just carpentry then. But it was a process that the English were using, and the French, the Germans, and somewhat in different forms, but it was all basically custom fabricating each piece to go in one spot. And then you would number the pieces. They weren't interchangeable. And it involves you setting up full-size assemblies of walls, floors, roof planes, cross sections, and then scribing individual components into place. And it's quite a bit of work. And it takes a good-sized crew because you're muscling around long, big, heavy pieces of green timber all the time and repositioning them over and over to do this. So let's talk a little bit about how this process works. Sorry, my computer's stuck again here. Oh, there we go. So when you envision a three-dimensional frame, timber frame, the builder would envision two-dimensional sections. So this is an English illustration here. So our friend from England's watching tonight will be familiar with this. This came out of Richard Harris's book, Discovering Timber Frame Buildings. So this three-dimensional building is composed of two-dimensional frames. We have cross frames, which are here. We have longitudinal frames and roof frames. Not in every barn would have a roof frame scribed, but depending on the types of roofs. And then floor frames. In England, however, the ground floor is dirt. But pretty much in the States, almost from the get-go, buildings had floor frames as well, especially houses. But even the barn, I said, had the center bay was framed. So there'd be an additional frame in our buildings here would be that ground floor or first floor framing. So these frames had to be set out in a framing yard or on the building site, sometimes right on the floor where the building was going to be put up. And all those pieces scribed and fabricated to go together and then set aside. And every one of these had to be scribed. So that in this particular picture here, there's 5 cross frames, that's 5, plus 2 long frames, that's 7, plus 2 roof frames, that's 9, and plus 2, or at least 1 floor frame here. So it's 10 assemblies that had to be put together and taken apart before you had a 3D structure. This is out of a German book showing that each one of those frames required more than one step. So now I said we had 10 in that picture. You have at least 2 steps for every one of those, and sometimes 3. This is a German building, so it's a little different. Actually, you people from Ohio may find this more interesting. So you do the primary pieces of the sill and the plate, and then the main posts, and then you lay on braces, studs. And each time you scribe these pieces, you have to take the assembly apart to put them in because they're mortise and tenon. So this is after you scribe these pieces, you take it apart, you put them in, then you lay on even these smaller pieces here, which is some window and door framing and some horizontal girts. So this particular wall was a 3-step process. So that's what I meant about handling, shuffling around timber. There's a lot of that has to happen for this to work. And before one of these frames is taken apart, you need to number it because these pieces are not interchangeable. Pretty much, there's a few things that you can interchange, but like you could switch the number 2 pair of rafters with a number 4 pair of rafters, and it wouldn't make any difference as long as you have the 2 4s together and the 2 2s together. You're okay. basically everything else in the building would have to go in only one spot. So the builder came up with different numbering systems. It's usually Roman numerals done with a chisel. And sometimes there's little flags on them, like you see here. So one side of the building will have a flag and the other side won't. They'll both be the same number, but it'll be a flag on one side and not on the other. There's a tool that can do circles, which we're going to see in a minute. And then a gouge chisel can be used to make these gouge-shaped marks. But needless to say, the carpenter had a system that he was used to working with and would stick with it. So here, these marks are made with a tool called a race knife, which is a little hook knife and then a compass point adjacent to it, so you can actually swing an arc. So this is about 1 3/4 inches in diameter here. That's where the point went. You actually can swing that arc, and you could do Arabic numbers if you wanted to with this, but it's typically used in addition to Roman numerals. So this is number 4. And by the way, it's not like the clock. It's not with a 1 before the B, because if you turn that upside down, it could look like a 6. And the same thing goes with the X, and 4 and X and a 1 before it, or X or 1 after it. Is it 9 or is it 11? So it wasn't like the clock. So this is how number 4 was done. And 9 was typically done with a V and 4 of these marks. There's one other type they would use. Anyway, this particular mark here goes right across the joint. There's a little bit of wane here and bark, so it's kind of discontinuous. But elsewhere in this particular building, the marks went right across the joint. So they call those marriage marks, because when you put them together, they line right up. So not only does each one have a number on it, but the number, it's pretty no nonsense. You put it together and you got the right piece in there when you assemble it, even if you can't count the numbers on it. So there's a picture of the race knife. So you can see that little compass point, and there's a little hook knife. This is an 18th century version of it here. They still make these new that loggers or foresters used to mark on the end grain of logs. It's not this handsome a piece, but it's still used quite a bit. And occasionally they use that to make the date. So here's the 1798 date in a beech post in a barn. And generally, when you find it made with this tool, and especially if you find distortion, that it looks like the circle was made when the wood was green before it checked and split open, it's pretty much proof that this was the date of the building and that the builder put it in there, or at least that the builder put it in there. He may have had the wrong date. He may not have been good at the calendar, but at least the builder put that mark in there. So I find these rarely, 1 out of 100 buildings or something will have this mark in it. Now, this is a number that's done with a gouge, a chiseled gouge, and this is a V here, so that's number 9. And when I see this in a barn, and when I walk into a barn and just spot one of these gouged marks, I instantly think to myself, this barn is probably before 1795, because that's about when, in my era at least, the Scotch pattern auger was introduced. Now, I mention this because before the Scotch pattern auger, they used a shell auger, which required a gouge to start a hole for it, or it would just wander around on the surface aimlessly. And after that point, when the Scotch pattern auger came in, it had a little screw tip on it, which would, lock itself right into the wood and make its own perfect hole. So anyway, that's just, I found this to be true, because once you've switched over to the Scotch pattern auger, you don't need the gouge anymore in your toolbox. So nobody's going to carry around heavy tools in their toolbox unless they're going to be using them. So integral to these frames is the English tying joint. And this was in use since about 1250 AD and right up to the end of the tradition in England. In fact, people are reusing again now, doing new frames. And used in our country up till about 1840 is probably about the latest I've seen, but usually it's gone by the time the square rule comes in because it's no longer necessary in joinery. But it's a complicated three-dimensional joint where you have a flared post. You put the butt end of a flared log up, hew it out with a flare, and that has two tenons on top. One goes into the plate here, and the other one goes into the tie beam here. And they call that a gunstock post or a jowled post. Sometimes they're just tapered, and sometimes it's kind of just a gradual flare. Jowled post is what they call them in England. And then the rafter is usually mortise and tenon into the tie beam. A principal rafter is mortise and tenon in. And then where the tie beam laps over the plate, there's a lap dovetail joint cut in there. And that secures the walls from spreading. So again, this joint is more to facilitate scribing than it is to be some sort of engineering wonder. That's the reason why it's so complicated. It allows you to assemble cross frames completely with the rafter on it, or longitudinal frames completely with the posts, or the tie beams with the plate, which is the sort of the eave level framing of the building. And part of the process of scribing, there's actually two techniques of scribing. One is called tumbling, and one is called the double cut. And in the tumbling, it's for most of the pieces in a building. It's a piece that goes between two other pieces, and that means braces, girts, joists, studs, beams, rafters, most of the pieces in the barn, everything except those English tying joints. And it's pretty simple and straightforward. You lay the piece over where it's going to go. So these are the two timbers that it's going to go between here. You're looking at the ends of them. You rotate that top timber so its face side is down. You turn it 90 degrees and put a little tick mark right here at each end where it mates that surface. And then you tip it back up, which is where it is now. And you move this beam back and forth until you put a square on this lower piece, or a straight edge. And you move this upper one this way until that mark right there lines up with the edge of the square. And then you draw a line down the square on both sides. Then you go down and do the same thing the other end. You probably have to tap it back a ways, or either way, until that mark there lines up. And then what you've got is the length on the surface and the angles from that length down. And you cut the piece as shown here to match the timber that it's going into. So that's tumbling kind of in a nutshell. The other method is far too complicated to explain in the slideshow that only lasts 45 minutes or an hour. Needless to say, it involves double cutting, putting a short tenon into the mortise, scribing that with a pair of dividers, and then taking it out, recutting it to the scribe. And it also involves what's called a 2-foot mark here, which was used by other countries as well. The French had something like this. The Germans had something like this. The French called it a "bring me back" mark, I think. Anyway, it involves when you're doing this three-dimensional joint, you need to have some sort of reference because once you take the piece off of there and put a different piece on, you need that back. So that's what this 2-foot mark is for. And I'm sorry I can't explain it in the short time I have tonight. The other mark you'll find in a scribe building is a level mark. Any timber that has to be assembled in more than one plane, like for instance, the post is assembled in the cross frames as well as the longitudinal frames. So you need a mark on there, which is going to give you that either level or perpendicular when you're going to rotate this piece to go into another assembly that's perpendicular. So there may be one of these on a piece, or on a plate there might be 3 of these all in the same plane sort of spaced out down the plate. So let's run through really quick. This is my barn when I did the floor system. This is the long sills here and the cross sills, and they're tumbled into place. I set up everything in a sort of a level area up on cribbing, the right spacing apart, and tumble these pieces. So I've assembled that, and now I'm tumbling the floor joist into position. These are full-length floor joists. And a little trick that I've done is these joists are round log joists, and they get notched into the sill. So you do the two sides first, and then put them in upside down in the mortise, and chop and adds that down until it's flush, like I'm checking here. And then you flip it over, and it's flush, you know, when you turn it right side up. So the floor has been put together, and now I've laid on the plates, which are these timbers right here, and the tie beams, and scribed those with the lap dovetail joints. So the drawing is basically the floor. So if you put the floor together and it's the right size and has the right base spacing and it's level and square, anything you lay on top of that and flush up with that will also be level and square. So it becomes your drawing for much of the rest of the work. And here's the longitudinal wall being laid out. These are the 4 posts and the plate. In most of these barns, the proportions allow you to lay both longitudinal walls on at the same time and have a little bit of clearance. So they've been framing these for so long, they had all the little bugs worked out of the system. And they use what's called draw boring or draw pinning, where you put the thing together, mark where the hole is on the tenon, and take it apart and bore a hole slightly closer to the shoulder, like 1/8 of an inch or so. And that's what I'm doing right here. And then you don't have to withdraw it all the way, just withdraw it enough to do that. And then when you put it back together and put a pin in there, it will draw it up nice and tight because of those offset holes. And here's the other long frame with the braces and the girts and the door header put in there. Now here are some drift pins. These are iron pins. They also call them hook pins. And they're done to use like pegs to pull things together temporarily while you're doing the scribing process. And because they're iron, you can get them out. They won't swell up if it rains overnight, like a wooden pin would. And these you could pry up. There's different varieties of these. But I just want to point out a couple things here. One is the board channel. This is a 1x1 groove that runs the entire length of the plate, the tie beams, and it's where you slip boards into when you put the barn up, so you don't have to get up there and nail those boards in place. You'll also notice that the 2 braces are coming together in an exact sort of spot. They're in a shared mortise here. And I used to think that was a little bit on the weak side, that if you had a lot of racking in the building, it would put a lot of force on those pins. But it's actually done to save effort and steps in the scribing process. So when you scribe things, the mortises are made first before you even put this plate into the assembly. So you can then swing one brace, you can scribe one brace and swing it into the mortise because the other one isn't there yet. Check the fit, drill your hole for your peg and do all that stuff. And then number it, take it out of there and do the same with the other brace without moving the whole assembly, because there's that extra slot there where you can swing these tenons into their mortises. Here's some other hook pins. This is the traditional type right here. These I've had made. These are also traditional ones as well. This one was old silo hoops that a blacksmith, threw out to a point. And the reason why you want a hole there is so you can stick another pin in there and kind of work it out, like unscrewing it to get it out of the peg hole. So that's a pretty handy thing. All right, and then the cross frames are done. There's 4 cross frames, and you can fit 2 on at a time. And with the right faces up, they're not going to be in the way of each other, which is pretty interesting. And some of the joints, actually, because you're scribing them, you scribe them to meet a waney edge. You end up with things like this, with a little piece down here and this little angle cut on the shoulder of the tenon. And the joints that are scribed like that are double cut. You first saw it. So here, this line here would have been saw right up like that. And then this last 3/4 of an inch or whatever of the scribe would have been chopped out with a chisel, just like I'm showing you here. And be a sharp chisel too. And this is a pretty hard piece of wood here. This is yellow birch. And that's what the finished joint looks like. And you can see the little saw cut right there. So if you find this in an old timber, it's evidence of the double cut. And here's the 2 roof slopes put on at the floor at the same time, all flushed up. These are principal rafted with through purlins, common purlins. I had a few joints in them because I want to see how that was done. And the rest of them are full length. They run the length of the building and actually cantilever out to hold up the overhang. Now, to hold these buildings together, they used pins or trunnels or tree nails, or we call them pegs today, but traditionally they were called pins. And they're split out of straight grain material. Oak is great. Red oak is a wonderful thing, but you can use hickory or ash. This is ash here. And it's done with a froe and a mallet or a club. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm just quartering these pieces. And then I'm going to split out blanks that are roughly, well, if you want like a 1-inch pin, 1-inch diameter finished pin, you're going to split them out just under an inch to square blanks. And then using a shaving horse, which is what I'm sitting on right here, you're going to use a draw knife. The shaving horse is basically a foot vise. So it frees up both your hands for doing this kind of work. And I can make about a pin a minute, a finished pin, octagonal pin per minute. There's a close up of that. So you start out with square, and then these, I'm actually making pegs for my flooring here, so they're going to be square. But if you're making an octagonal peg, you take the 4 corners off. So you have a ribbon face and then a shave face and ribbon face, shave face all the way around. So it's pretty quick to make these things if you split them the right size. Here's some traditional pins. This one on top actually came from England, 14th century. The other ones are American or Canadian, and they're basically octagonal. They have a gradual taper and then a blunt taper near the tip. I like this sort of shape right here with this nose cone of a rocket kind of thing here. It's faster looking. It's less likely to grab and cause problems as you're driving in. These offset holes. This is more of a blunt point here. These are square pins where you want to fasten something down. Actually, this is an octagonal one with a square head. I pulled these out of rafters, out of floors, or out of half laps. Anytime the peg has to actually draw 2 pieces of wood together and hold them there. So the barns are put up piecemeal, typically, according to my evidence, not by raising parties. At least not these smaller sort of family barns. It'd be put by the builder's crew, probably with the owner and his sons, and maybe some neighbors. I don't know, but put up 1 piece at a time, and braced off as they went, and connected with girts and braces and such. And then the plates would be lifted on, and here I'm using a gin pole, which is an ancient lifting device where you have a long straight pole set up with guy lines, 2 guy lines going back and 1 going forward, and then a block and tackle hung from that. So it's like a fixed boom of a crane, and it's a direct vertical lift typically. And here's the plate that's being lifted up. I managed to do this by myself. In fact, I had my 12-year-old daughter come out and lift one up by herself, with enough turns on the rope and the pulleys, you get some pretty good mechanical advantage. There's a shot of the gym pole. Just a light spruce pole. Anyway, there's the finished barn on its foundation, waiting siding and roofing. There's the English tying joint. Here I'm putting on the boards, and these boards are slip matched. They're put on in order as they were sawed out of the log. That's why all the knots line up on there. And they're 16, 18 inches wide here, or maybe they were wider than that. I don't know. They're all came out of one log. I did the whole gable with one log. And you see they fit into a groove at the top, the board channel. Oh, and by the way, you only have to nail them here, here, and here. Now, I made my barn a little bit higher because I'm a tall fella. So normally this would be 6 feet off the floor, this curve right there. So the carpenter could easily reach that. You didn't have to get off the ground. You didn't need a ladder to put your siding on. In fact, you could do the gable from planks inside, sort of start from one end and get the other end, and you'd have to get outside for the last board or so. But there's very little scaffolding required with that board channel. So the square rule, I said, came in generally after 1801, and it's a faster system. In it, you don't have any describing, you don't have any of this pre-assembly. You cut one piece at a time, and you don't have to trial fit anything. It's just going to fit on raising day. So it's more like a modular construction system. Just I'm running over on time here. Sorry, I'll try to speed things up a little bit. Here's a post from a square rule building with all these little gains cut into it, these housings. And when you see something like that, reductions at the top and the bottoms of posts, that's square rule. And in this area came in, like I said, 1801 is the oldest one I found. It's possible there's something earlier out in Ohio or farther down south. I don't know. I'm just going by what I've seen. The timber was lined, and here this post has used red chalk, which is a permanent chalk. And there's two lines on this post. One is for the joinery, edge of the joinery, for the mortise of the tenon. And the other one is the timber that you're going to frame it to. Here's another picture. Here we go. Yeah. So this is a 13-inch square piece, but it's framed to 12. And that 2 inches is the edges of the mortise and tenons. So it'd be a 2-2 layout on the joinery. Anyways, I was so lucky to find this barn. I've since found more, but this was earlier in my career, and I said, "Ooh, bingo! That's it." You know, I'm so glad to use permanent chalk on that. So in a scribe building, all the braces can be cut the same length, and when you're putting the building up, you can grab a brace out of the pile, and it's going to fit anywhere, or it should. And it's all based on Pythagoras here. Again, a squared plus b squared is equal c squared. And the carpenter's square usually had these numbers stamped in it, so you didn't have to do your own calculating. Pretty early on, they had the numbers stamped in there for different size braces for the 2 foot, the 3 foot, the 4 foot brace, etc. And then the square rule frame no longer needed to have those English tying joints, so they went with a drop tie frame. So that starts dropping right about the time the square rule comes in. But it's the same sort of barn layout otherwise as the earlier version. Oh, and a lot of times they'll have purlin plates. Now, they had some of these with the scribe rule buildings as well, but these would have drop ties between the purlin posts as well. So I'm just going to run through some quick barn pictures. These are barns in my area, Western Massachusetts, but many other people will recognize these barns. So this barn right here is an English barn. This is some sort of a shed built on later. You can see the door has been changed. The door would have been taller originally, but there's still the animal door here, and it would have been one over here too. I can't tell if there's one in this picture. This barn on the left is an English barn. There's your door off center. There's your cow door into the narrow bay. And there's the draft animal bay. Here's another one that's been moved and restored, but again, this one's been turned, I think. But that's the cow bay, threshing bay, draft animal bay. This one's pretty obvious. Sometimes I believe the original barns had a row of lights above them. Other times it could have been added later. The doors would have been hinged, not sliding. This is a later door type here. This one's in kind of rough shape, but same thing. Here's your door. Somebody put a little pent roof on here later, but I believe that's still the animal door there, cow door. You notice these are all the same proportion. Again, they're all based on the equilateral triangle and the 30 by 40 footprint pretty much. Cupola is not original, but it certainly looks good on this building. But here's that cow door, threshing bay doors. There's no door shown here, but I'm sure if you peeled off that, you can see the framing for the original door. Here's another one. This door is not original. Pretty much all have about a 9 and 12 pitch. Sometimes it's a little steeper, a little flatter, but most of them are 9 and 12. You know, somebody's made some modifications here, but there's that animal bay. Threshing bay. Now this one is, let's see, this is the south face, the southeast face, right? Yeah. So that you can kind of flip the plan because there's doors at each end. You can make this thing work as long as the animals are the cows are to the sunnier side of the barn in the morning, I guess for milking probably. Here's another one without the doors anymore here, but that's definitely the same barn. Here's one with shingles, same thing, off center doors. Here's two English barns put together. This barn was moved and reset up, but it was originally found there were two barns butted end to end, and each one had a threshing bay. You know, they were so standard that you could grab a barn from somewhere else and it would fit up against your barn perfectly. You know, roof pitch, you know, width, everything would be the same, you know, within an inch or two usually. So it's very common to expand your operation and just grab a barn from some other property, roll it there and plug it up against the end. Hinge doors like it would have had originally. And by the way, that's the way braces should go on a door. They should work so they're in compression to keep the door from sagging. Sometimes people run them this way and they're working in tension, and you're relying upon nails to keep the door from sagging rather than just the wood itself. So that's something to keep in mind if you're building doors. Here's one in my town. They oftentimes are right across the street from the house. So as they build roads and widen roads, the barns would be right up on the road. And they fill too, so they put dirt up against the barn to cause the sills to rot out. Here's a beautiful one in Cummington, a beautiful frame, but it's in terrible shape because they've let it go. This actually had a little addition, a lean-to addition with English tying joints in it and gunstock posts. Some pretty cool stuff in it, but it's gone now. Here's one I was involved with the restoration on. That's an English barn, and this is actually one here. This part of this one, they're both the same proportion. One's just a smaller version of it, but the roofs and everything were the same. And the equilateral triangle fits in it, just like in the big one. And this barn would have been built on flat ground originally, but it was rolled out over a basement to create sort of the multifunctional, multi-level barns of the mid 1800s, the New England barn, as we call them here. So he would roll these English barns and make them into a function like a New England barn. So there you have it. It's my little blurb about the English barn. So I guess I'll turn it back to Sarah for questions.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. I really especially enjoyed seeing the photographs and hearing your personal tale of building your barn and seeing some of those techniques that I've only ever really read about actually play out there in your photographs. We had an early question from Rudy actually talking about threshing floors. And he mentioned how ours, being most Ohio barns or many Ohio barns, have splined threshing floors, and wondered if you see that frequently in New England as well.
I would say frequently, but I have seen it. Yes. The good thing about splining rather than tongue and grooving is you can flip the board or flip the plank either way. It gives you more freedom. Whereas if it's tongue and groove, you got just one way you can put that down. So a lot of times they use tapered planks. So logs are tapered. So when you saw them out, if you saw them with a taper, you get more wood out of the same log. So you would lay each time you laid another plank, you would flip it end for end with the one before it, so that you wouldn't start going, off to one side with your tapers. You keep flipping it back, so that it ends up staying pretty much parallel. So yeah, I have seen that, Rudy, but not as much.
The spline
it's more
joint
work
is
to make
easier.
the splines.
The spline joint is easier to cut too, because all you're doing is pushing the groove plane rather than the tongue plane.
Right.
Which is taking up twice as much wood. So the spline joinery is actually easier as far as work goes.
But you got to make the spline.
Yeah, right.
And it's hard to make that little skinny piece that's the right size, hard to plane along, 12-foot long, half by 3/4 piece or whatever it is.
Right. Yeah, usually half inch is what we find here.
Yeah.
But I honestly, I don't think I've seen any tongue and groove floors in the barns that we've worked on here in Ohio. I think they've all been splined.
And how thick are the floors usually?
Usually 2-inch. Sometimes you'll find 3-inch, but not all that often. Usually about 2-inch.
Okay. It's far more common here to do the double layer, with a 1/2-inch slit work underneath the joint. Just faster. There's no no planing, tongue grooving, or anything involved with that. That's much more common. Yeah.
Jack, we have a question from Dan Troth. He asked, what was the formula for making the red chalk?
That's a great question. I've heard of red ochre, but I'm not sure actually where that comes from. It might be a stone that you grind up, maybe mix it with linseed oil or something. I don't know, make it stickier. But yeah, somebody should do some research on that. They also use that to number pieces in a building. I've seen barns that were dismantled and they had the original chisel marks, but then they had the red ochre marks, like crayon marks, which are pretty early, because the builder didn't understand the original numbering system, or maybe parts of it were gone. I don't know, but they renumbered it using that same thing. So I don't know, you probably call up the chalk manufacturers today. It's probably the same formula for red chalk today.
Hey, Jack, can you hear me?
Sure.
Yeah, this is Dan here.
Yeah, I can see that. Nice to see you again, Dan.
Good to see you. The race knife that you showed us from the late 1700s, it had a hole in it. What was that hole for?
I think that was decorative.
Oh, that was decorative. Okay.
Yeah.
And then next question. I have 12 questions here, Jack.
Well, that's all?
Just 12. So we found a barn on one of our tours, and Laura, Rudy, and the rest of it, you might remember what year this was, but we were looking closely and we saw the red chalk here and there. And then written on the bents was, in this red chalk or crayon, I'm thinking of some sort of crayon, was the word bent. And it said bent 1, bent 2, big letters. When do you see the reference to the term bent in Massachusetts?
Well, bent actually comes from a Dutch word, gebint, Gebint, which means like a cross frame. So who turned me onto this was Ian Stewart, New Netherlands Timber Framing. So that's pretty likely that's where it comes from. Gebint, bent, an assemblage of timbers. But I'm not sure when the English started using it. But I will tell you, I found a barn where all the timbers were labeled with that red crayon of what their place in the frame was. So it said purlin post on it, tie beam, girt.
Wow.
I don't know if the braces were labeled, but it was cool to find that. You know, it's like the nomenclature of a barn was right there. It was all on the pieces. So the builder must have, as he got the timbers from the sawyer, marked out what everything was for, just to keep track of it, you know, put them all together.
What are the wood species that you find in the barns there in Massachusetts?
Oh gosh, everything. It's usually what was standing on the owner's property. So we have 3 forest types in New England. We have the oak, oak hickory transitional forest, which has red oak, some white oak, hickories, obviously, pines, and chestnuts. And then we have the northern hardwood forest, which is the beech, yellow birch, and sugar maple forest with hemlock mixed in with that. And then we have the northern softwood forest, which is most of northern New England, which is spruce and balsam fir. So they wouldn't use balsam typically, they'd be using the spruce. So when people ask me what was the most common woods used in New England, everybody wants to say oak or chestnut or pine or something like that, but it's not, because the whole of northern New England, which is Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, is pretty much all these northern forest types. So it's going to be beech or spruce. Those are the 2 most common woods for all of northern New England. And in my town, you know, I'm in that same forest type, so it's beech and spruce. We'll get a little sugar maple, some yellow birch, sometimes basswood, you know, like a spattering of stuff. But most everything is beech or spruce. And spruce is very straight and you know, very little taper on the trees, so it's quick to hew it. You pick a tree about the right size and you knock the 4 edges off, and you're pretty you got a timber pretty quickly.
Your 30 by 40 English threshing barns, you talked about threshing and winnowing the wheat and everything, and then you said throw it in a sack. When did you start to see granaries in barns?
I don't find granaries in these barns, so I'll bet you all their grain could probably fit in 1 sack.
Wow. Okay.
2 sacks. You know, this is not a big operation. The floor is only, you know, 12 by 30, and it's a family supply of grain.
Okay.
So, you know, in the Dutch barns in New York State, they have grain rooms, like a 10 by 10 room, sometimes with bars over the windows. But they had a huge threshing floor. They had a 30 by 50 threshing floor, and they had sometimes 2 threshing devices set up with animals pulling them. So that was a huge operation. So, you know, I don't know exactly how much grain they had, but whatever they had, they'd take it and put it up in their attic or their house probably to keep it.
Jack, do you think that the Dutch barns are earlier than the English barns generally in New England, or what? I'm not sure about the dating on that, but, you know, relative to the English barn discussion, was the English barn the earlier barns that we saw here, or was there something?
Well, the Dutch settled New York State in the 1600s, so we don't have any really early Dutch barns surviving. In fact, some of them were house barns. There's evidence, you know, documentary evidence of house barns where you lived in the same building. One end would be for the family, and the other end would be for the animals, and it was open right through, so you could hear the cows in their stanchions at night. So, I mean, the oldest English barn that's been dendro dated is 1695, and that's currently in storage right here in the Berkshire County area here. Looking for a new home, by the way. But I'm not sure what the oldest Dutch barn is. Probably 1730s, 40s, something like that. So they would have been, you know, with the first settlers. So it's hard to say which ones came first. I would guess probably the English, but you know, I don't know for sure on that. There's nothing surviving from those early times.
Well, who built?
All right, I'm going to interject, Dan, since you've broken the rules, which you always do. So I will.
I wondered how he got away with that.
Because I just can't rein him in. That's why. I'll limit you, Dan, to one more quick question because I know this is such good information. And Jack, we're so fortunate to have you with us tonight. This was really enlightening. And I love that we have such an international audience tonight too. If you've been paying attention to the chat, we have somebody also joining us from Peru. So that's just fascinating. But Dan, one more question.
Okay, so who were the barn builders? German, English, Dutch? What other nationalities would build their barns? Or did everybody moving into America build barns? I always
No,
think it's
it would have
German.
been, you know, I've given a lot of barn tours in my area, and I'll pick a town, contact the historical society, and then we'll go and look at every single barn in town together. And then I'll pick 5 barns which represent the different periods, and we'll do a drive tour with about, 20 to 40 people. So the good thing about that is I get to see every single barn in the town. So what I see is very similar barns in the town. It looks like there's 3 or 4 builders that built all those barns, the 50 barns. And sometimes you'll be in one town and every barn will have a ridge beam in it. The next town over, no barns have a ridge beam. So what it's indicating is that the builders are working pretty close to home. They're so busy, there's no reason to travel any great distance. And they're building the same barn over and over and over. The farmer would provide the logs and probably hew them out, would take logs to the sawmill to get sawn out, get all the boarding sawed out and all that. And then the master builder would come in and frame up the building on the site, typically, and raise it up. And then for a house, the builder would probably finish it. For a barn, I think a lot of times the farmer finished it. It's pretty easy to just pop these boards in. Sometimes they're not even squared up when they go in that board channel. They're just the original log cut, they're just stuck in there. So it's looking like the farmer was good enough carpenter to put the siding on and the roofing and that sort of thing. And other times it's better done. So I suspect the builder was doing more of it. But the frame was always done by the master builder, and it would be a local person, and it would be done typically on the owner's site with the owner's timber.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but you're saying, but what nationality is it?
Oh. So in New England, they're English.
They're all English. Okay.
Maybe Scottish or Irish or something, but it's English. But I'm on the border with New York State, where the Dutch were reigning supreme, and there was also a lot of German immigrants that came through. There was a great famine in Germany, early 1700s, and the English took advantage of that. They recruited a lot of these German migrants to come over here and set up tar works along the Hudson River using the pitch pines that grew there to provide naval stores, the pitch from the trees. And they didn't find as many forests as they wanted, or they ended up turning loose a lot of these Palatine Germans to go off on their own. So we have quite a bunch of German structures in New York State, but they don't look anything like Ohio or Pennsylvania. They look more like a lowland German barn rather than a Swiss, a Schweitzer type of structure. So anyway, in New York State, you get a mixture. You can have English, you can have Dutch, you can have German. But in Massachusetts, most of Massachusetts and New England, it's pretty much English people doing the work.
Thank you, Jack.
We got to get you out here, Jack, and to Ohio, which is the Northwest Territory. But sometime you got to get out here.
Sure.
Thank you. We would love that, Jack. We would love to have you, perhaps even some year, join us for our conference, our annual conference. That would be wonderful.
Again.
It's been a while since I've been out there.
Again, yeah. Okay, good. Well, I'm going to bring things to a close tonight. Again, Jack, thank you so much. I want to express really our sincere gratitude from Friends of Ohio Barns for your time this evening. This was so enlightening, and I want to thank everyone who joined us tonight as well, and for your time. And please do remember that registration is open for our conference in April. You can go to friendsofohiobarns.org and find more information about the conference and all of our other upcoming programming and information about membership as well. So a big round of applause for Jack this evening. Again, thank you.
Great stuff, Jack.
Thank you, Jack.
Yeah, great stuff.
And we look forward to seeing many of you at the conference in April. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.
All right.
Good night.
Good night.
Night.